You wake up to silence. Not peace. Not rest. Just silence, the kind that feels hollow, like the world itself has stopped breathing. The air is colder than it should be. You can see it, swirling in front of your face with every exhale. The windows are rimmed with frost, even though it's barely October. You don't remember the last time you were warm. Your body aches. Not from work, not anymore. From the inside. A slow, gnawing pain that never leaves, like your stomach is folding in on itself. The ache isn't sharp. It's worse. It's constant. Dull. Heavy. A silence of the flesh. You push yourself up from the floor. The mattress is gone, burned weeks ago when the wood ran out. The smell of ashes still lingers. You slept on straw last night. You think. Time isn't clear anymore. Hunger smudges the edges of memory. Your sister doesn't stir. She's curled up in the corner, her knees pulled tight against her chest. Her eyes are open, but she doesn't see you. Her lips are cracked. Her breath is thin. You wonder if she's still with you. The walls creak. The roof groans. Outside, the wind carries a sound, not quite a scream, not quite a song. Something in between. The voice of a land that's been emptied. You step outside. The sun is rising, but it gives no warmth. The sky is gray, colorless, like the soil beneath your feet. In the distance, fields stretch toward the horizon. Brown. Barren. Silent. But you know they weren't always like this. You remember the smell of wheat. The shimmer of golden stalks under summer light. You remember laughter, hands cutting grain, backs bent not in pain, but in purpose. Harvest meant life. Now harvest means death. The silos are still full. You can see them. Tall. Silent. Guards at the base, rifles slung casually across their shoulders. Their faces say nothing. They don't have to. A cart rolls past you. It creaks under the weight of sacks, grain sacks, heavy and sealed. Bound for Moscow. Bound for trade. Bound for someone else's bread. You haven't eaten in 4 days. A child runs across the road. He's holding something in his fist. You squint. It's small. Pale. A piece of potato, maybe. Or bark. He looks over his shoulder. Too late. A crack echoes through the air. He falls. The guards don't shout. They don't run. They just walk. Methodical. Practiced. The child doesn't move. No one screams. No one ever screams anymore. You pass 3 bodies on the way to the well. One is a woman. Older. Her hands are frozen around a tin bowl. Empty. The other 2 are children, slumped against a tree. You don't look at their faces. You don't need to. You've seen enough. At night, you hear the whispers. Mothers boiling leather shoes, praying the glue will calm their children's stomachs. Fathers trading wedding rings for bread and getting sawdust in return. Families vanishing, one by one. In the villages, rumors speak of neighbors eating the dead. Some say the dead were still breathing when the knives came out. No one knows what's true anymore. No one asks. You wonder if this is what hell feels like, not fire, not punishment. Just absence. Of food. Of choice. Of God. And the worst part? It didn't have to happen. The land still grows. The grain still ripens. But the grain is not yours. The law says it belongs to the state. And taking even a handful, 5 ears, no more, is treason. Punishable by death. You live on soil that feeds a continent, and still, you starve. Not because the rains failed. Not because war came. But because someone decided you should. This is not famine. This is a weapon. And you're standing at ground zero. You live on soil that feeds a continent, and still, you starve. Not because the rains failed. Not because war came. But because someone decided you should. This is not famine. This is a weapon. And you're standing at ground zero. Before the hunger. Before the guards. Before the silence. There was something else. Fields that stretched forever, yellow, gold, endless, rippling like a sea beneath the sun. The earth was black and fertile, so rich you could bury a nail and pull up a plow. Villages lined with cherry orchards. Children running through barley fields. Bread rising in warm ovens while elders told stories that belonged to no empire. This was Ukraine, before the storm. You don't need a map to know its value. Empires did. They always did. The Austro-Hungarians, the Russians, the Ottomans, all carved pieces from it, claimed its language, silenced its songs, burned its histories. But the land could not be taken. It grew. It gave. It endured. And so the wars came. The First World War shattered what remained of order. And as the old empires died, Ukraine stood at a crossroads, uncertain, torn, and exposed. Revolution in Russia. Chaos in the streets of Petrograd. The Tsar was gone. In his place. A vacuum that swallowed everything. In that dark, chaotic space, Ukraine saw a sliver of light, a chance. Independence. A nation of its own. And for a brief, burning moment, it seemed possible. But the moment collapsed under the weight of armies. First the Red Army. Then the White. Then the Germans. Then the Poles. Then warlords with no names, flags with no meaning. Each one marched through Ukrainian soil with the same boots, the same hunger for control, the same disregard for the people who lived beneath their heels. Cities burned. Villages emptied. Borders shifted like tides. Between 1917 and 1921, Ukraine changed hands more than a dozen times. And when the dust settled, the red banner was the one still waving. Moscow had won. The Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic was born, not as a nation, but as an appendage. Bound by treaties. Bound by silence. Bound by fear. But Moscow had learned something in those chaotic years, something it would never forget. The Ukrainian spirit was dangerous. It remembered too much. It asked too many questions. It could not be trusted. So it had to be managed. And that's when they gave you a gift. They called it Ukrainianization, a policy, a promise, a performance. Ukrainian language would be used in schools. Ukrainian books would be published. Ukrainian culture would be celebrated. It felt, for a moment, like freedom had returned. Like the blood spilled during the wars had not been wasted. Streets echoed again with poetry. Churches reopened. Farmers spoke in their own tongue without whispering. But it was a lie. A temporary stage set by careful hands, not to empower, but to pacify. To keep the embers from reigniting. To make you think you were being seen, while the walls were slowly closing in. Because even as Ukrainian songs filled the air, Moscow was listening. Watching. Waiting. They allowed the language, but not the thought behind it. They allowed the books, but not the ideas that lived in them. They allowed the flags, but not the independence they symbolized. And in the shadows of this false freedom, the machinery of control was sharpening its blades. You didn't know it yet. You were planting seeds. But not just in the soil. In the minds of your children, in the stories at your hearth, in the names you whispered for your dead. You were cultivating memory. Identity. A sense of self that no empire could erase. And to the men in Moscow, that was unforgivable. Because history is not written by the victors. It is survived by the dangerous. The ones who remember. And in Ukraine, remembering was about to become a crime. You've heard the silence. Now you've seen the seeds of betrayal planted in peace. If you think history like this shouldn't be buried under propaganda, subscribe. If you won't, tell us why in the comments. We read every reason. Some will echo more than others. You were promised language, culture, land. You were promised your own future. But in Moscow, a man was watching the promise like one watches a fuse. He did not speak in flourishes. He did not shout like the revolutionaries before him. His voice was flat, deliberate, carved from granite. And when he spoke, people disappeared. His name was Joseph Stalin. And he had been waiting. While Lenin coughed blood into his pillow, half paralyzed and fading from history, Stalin climbed the stairs of power two at a time, silently, ruthlessly, never looking back. He wasn't the loudest in the room, but he was always the last man standing. And Lenin knew. In his final writings, dictated with trembling hands, Lenin didn't praise Stalin. He warned about him. Called him dangerous. Called him unstable. Told the party, in plain, desperate words, that the man who now controlled the machinery of government was not the man to carry the revolution forward. But no one listened. Lenin died. And Stalin smiled. With the body still warm, Stalin took control, first in a group, then alone. Trotsky fled. Rivals were purged. Friends vanished. And the ideals of the revolution, equality, liberty, bread for all, were folded into neat, blood-stained propaganda. Now, the future belonged to one man. And his vision was made of concrete, steel, and smoke. He didn't want a country. He wanted a machine. A machine that would churn out weapons faster than the West. A machine that would spit factories onto the skyline, chew through forests, flood rivers, drown villages, and pull the Soviet Union from the mud of its past into an iron-plated future. He called it progress. And progress had a price. But he wouldn't pay it. You would. The engine of this future needed fuel. Not coal. Not oil. It needed grain. And Stalin knew where to get it. Your land. Your harvest. Your body. He looked at the countryside, at millions of small farms, family plots, ancestral lands passed down through centuries, and saw chaos. Disorder. Resistance. He saw you. You, the farmer with calloused hands and pride in your own field. You, who fed your children from the earth you owned. You, who owed Moscow nothing. To Stalin, that made you the enemy. So he gave you a name, Kulak. It didn't matter if you were rich or poor. Didn't matter if you owned a single cow or employed a single helper. The word didn't describe a person, it marked a target. Once labeled, you were no longer a citizen. You were an obstacle. A saboteur. A nail sticking up in a system built on hammers. And the system came for you. The policy was called collectivization, a gentle word for a violent act. It meant your land was no longer yours. Your tools were no longer yours. Your grain was no longer yours. The state took it all. In theory, for the good of all. In truth, for the good of Stalin. Those who resisted were beaten. Branded. Dragged from their homes in the night. Some were deported. Some were shot. Some simply vanished, erased from their villages, from the records, from memory. And those who stayed behind were forced into the new collective farms, where ownership was an illusion and survival became a lottery. But collectivization wasn't about feeding the people. It was about breaking them. If you can't own land, you can't build power. If you can't feed your children, you can't dream of independence. If you can't remember what freedom felt like, you'll stop wanting it. This was no agricultural policy. This was war, dressed in numbers, signed in ink, and delivered with the full weight of the state. And Ukraine was the front line. Because Stalin knew something else. He knew your land had always been rebellious. He knew it had always resisted the empire's grip. He knew its people still carried the ghost of independence in their blood. So he made an example of you. Not with tanks. Not with bombs. With quotas. With silence. With hunger. You've heard the speeches, but now you see the hands behind the curtain, tightening, bleeding, controlling. If this isn't the history they taught you, that's exactly why it must be told. Subscribe to Flashback Historian. If not, tell us why in the comments. We'll leave the space open, but the silence will speak louder. The winter of 1929 came early. Not with snow. Not with wind. But with a sentence. 6 words. Broadcast through party channels. Scribbled in official reports. Whispered by trembling hands in rural offices. Liquidate the kulaks as a class. Not punish. Not reform. Not re-educate. Liquidate. It wasn't just a policy. It was a commandment. And once spoken, it spread like fire across the steppes. One day, you were a farmer. A husband. A wife. The next, you were something else entirely, a threat. You might have owned 2 cows. Or maybe just an extra room. Perhaps your grandfather once sold grain at market. That was all it took. There was no hearing. No defense. Only a knock at the door. A list. And a truck waiting outside. The soldiers didn't shout. They didn't need to. The law had already declared you guilty. Guilty of feeding yourself. Guilty of surviving. Your family had 10 minutes to pack. No furniture. No keepsakes. No food. They took your boots, your winter coats, your tools. The doors were ripped from the hinges. The stoves dismantled. Your name was carved from the census as if it had never been written. And behind you, others were watching, not with judgment, but with terror. Because they knew the same truck would return tomorrow, and the day after that. And when it did, they would smile, salute, and point to the next door. That's how the liquidation began. Not with gunfire. Not with riots. But with neighbors signing neighbors into oblivion. Villages emptied. Family lines severed. Generations erased. And the land, the sacred, fertile, blood-soaked land, was absorbed. Not into farms. Into quotas. The new collective farms had no soul. No memory. They were gray, lifeless engines, operated by strangers, fueled by fear. The land no longer knew its keepers. The animals no longer answered familiar voices. Fields were plowed by hands that had never held soil before. And the harvests began to wither. Because without knowledge, land dies. Without care, the earth forgets how to give. By the end of 1930, entire regions saw their yields collapse. Wheat failed. Machinery broke. Livestock vanished. But no one dared say it aloud. To question the collective was to confess sabotage. To mention a missing tool was to risk being called a traitor. To mourn your old life was to whisper counter-revolution. So you kept your head down. You worked. You obeyed. And you starved. By spring, the cities were already forming lines, long, silent processions of desperate faces snaking around bakeries and depots, waiting for bread that never came. In the countryside, things were worse. There were no lines. There was no bread. There were only mothers trading sewing needles for crusts. Fathers boiling boots. Children scratching at frozen roots with fingernails. And still, the party said the plan was working. Still, the newspapers printed harvest numbers pulled from fantasy. Still, the trains rolled east, carrying what little grain remained not to feed the people, but to satisfy Stalin's dreams and the West's appetite for Soviet exports. You stood in a village surrounded by fields. Fields that once fed millions. Fields now guarded by men with rifles. Fields that belonged to no one and served nothing. And as you watched the cattle carts rumble away, grain sacks tied tight, your labor vanishing down distant tracks, you realized something that would never leave you. You weren't the farmer anymore. You were the crop. Planted in fear. Watered in silence. Harvested by force. You were born in the land of bread, and still found yourself begging for crumbs. If this contradiction haunts you the way it haunted them, subscribe. If not, explain yourself in the comments. Say it loud. Let history hear you. Before Ukraine starved, another land broke. A vast, windswept steppe east of the Volga, Kazakhstan. Open skies, endless plains, a people shaped by motion, herding, silence, and survival. But in 1928, Stalin's blueprint came for them too. The herds were seized. The yurts dismantled. The nomads labeled backward, unfit for the modern Soviet future. Their livestock, their lifeblood, was driven into collective hands. And when it resisted, it died. In 1 year, a third of Kazakhstan's animals perished. By the second, more than half. By the third, they were eating grass, bark, rats. Then, each other. Over 1.5 million people died. Entire clans vanished without a trace. The Soviet state called it an unfortunate setback. A bump in the road toward progress. A necessary purging of the past. But it wasn't random. It wasn't accidental. It was a test. Kazakhstan was the first proving ground, not just for collectivization, but for control. Could you erase a people by starving them? Could hunger break language, custom, resistance? Could the body's collapse teach the mind to forget? The answer, they found, was yes. And so the experiment moved west. By 1931, the weather had turned against the whole of the USSR. Winters came earlier. Frost clung longer. Rain fell too much, or not at all. Crops failed. But this wasn't new. Russia had seen bad years before. So had Ukraine. So had every patch of earth. But something was different now. The countryside wasn't allowed to adapt. Farmers weren't allowed to store grain, barter locally, or decide when and what to plant. Everything was centralized, theorized, redistributed from above, by men in offices who never touched soil, never knew hunger, and never heard the weeping. And as the skies darkened and the crops shriveled, Moscow stood firm. Grain procurement quotas were not reduced. They were raised. Because facts didn't matter. Only appearances. Stalin needed to show the world that the Soviet machine worked. That the 5-year plan was not just functioning, it was exceeding expectations. And so, the numbers were adjusted. The failures erased. The people, expendable. In Belarus, peasants collapsed in fields. In the Volga, children went blind from malnutrition. In Central Asia, family trees ended in silence. And still, Ukraine suffered differently. Because Ukraine wasn't just soil. It was symbol. It was memory, of Cossacks, of revolts, of language that refused to kneel. It was resistance, worn into the bones of its people. And for Stalin, that made it dangerous. While other regions faced starvation, Ukraine faced something worse. Starvation with intent. In Moscow, famine was a failure. In Ukraine, it was a tool. The weather may have triggered the crisis, but it did not explain the sealed borders. It did not explain the blacklists. It did not explain why grain-rich provinces were stripped bare while grain trains rolled east. And it did not explain the silence. Because in Ukraine, silence was enforced. The press was gagged. Letters censored. Movement restricted. The dying were not counted. They were erased. And when foreign journalists came asking questions, they were escorted to staged villages. Well-fed actors handed out fresh loaves in towns where thousands had died. The illusion was clean. Controlled. Criminal. But the fields were telling a different story. A story not of drought or disorder, but of design. History is repeating while most scroll past. If you're still watching, prove it. Hit subscribe. If not, leave your reasoning in the comments. Just know you're joining a long list of people who ignored the warning signs the first time. The grain still grew. That was the cruelest part. The fields didn't fail. The land still gave, even in that bitter season, even under the weight of mismanaged farms and broken tools, even with its keepers exiled or buried. The harvest still came. Not abundant. But enough. Enough to survive. Enough to endure the lean months. Enough for mothers to keep nursing, for children to keep walking, for the old to outlast one more winter. But survival was never part of the plan. The grain was not for the people who grew it. It was for Moscow. For export. For steel. For tanks, for prestige, for Stalin's legacy carved in stone. And so, the quotas were raised. Not slightly. Not cautiously. Not slightly. Not cautiously. Violently. Numbers scribbled in offices hundreds of miles away declared what each village owed. Not what they could give. Not what they had. What they owed. It didn't matter if the harvest had failed. It didn't matter if there were no seeds left for next season. The figures didn't account for weather, illness, death, or logic. They were targets carved in iron. And when the targets weren't met, punishment followed. First came the visits. Officials, escorted by guards, stepping into homes and barns, breaking locks, overturning bins, ransacking cellars. They took not just grain, but flour, bread, potatoes, pickled jars, sacks of beans hidden beneath floorboards. They took seed grain. They took animal feed. They took the future. Nothing was too small. Nothing was spared. If a mother had baked a loaf the night before, it was taken. If an old man had hoarded a handful of rye in his boot, it was confiscated. Entire villages were stripped bare. Even in homes with no food, they searched. And when they found nothing, they accused. Sabotage. Hoarding. Treason. Because in the eyes of the state, poverty was never a problem. It was a crime. And then came the trains. The red trains, they were called. Dozens of boxcars, iron wheels grinding against rusted tracks, pulled by steam and ideology. They rolled across the countryside with a hunger of their own. They didn't stop at every village. Only the ones still breathing. They took the last remnants of the harvest. The last proof that life had once existed here. And then they moved on, leaving behind silence. Soot. Grief. The grain was loaded with precision, stacked in sacks, measured by weight, guarded with rifles. Sometimes, the stations overflowed with grain, piled high beside stations while families starved just yards away. But no one touched it. Touching was theft. Theft was death. And so it sat, unguarded but forbidden, while stomachs rotted from the inside. In cities, people whispered about the villages, places they'd once visited in the summer, with orchards and singing. Now described only in past tense. In the countryside, famine had no name yet. Only evidence. Children who stopped growing. Eyes that no longer blinked. Skin drawn tight across cheekbones. The slow erosion of dignity as people crawled on hands and knees searching for roots, grass, sawdust. And then came the first deaths. Not announced. Not recorded. Just noticed. A girl found in a barn, clutching a bowl of pine needles. An old man frozen on the steps of a shuttered grain depot. A mother collapsed in a queue, her child still strapped to her chest, crying for milk that would never return. The rumors spread faster than truth could be silenced. A famine, they said. No. A punishment, others whispered. Not because there was no food. But because there was. And it was leaving. Carted away under red banners, while the soil that bore it turned to graves. You didn't know it yet. But this was only the beginning. By August of 1932, the Soviet state gave the famine a face. Not a starving child. Not a skeletal mother. But a criminal. Not the kind who steals with malice, but the kind who steals because they want to live. And so, a law was passed. Short. Brutal. Surgical. If you take more than 5 ears of grain from a field, 5 small husks, 5 handfuls of survival, you are guilty of theft. Theft of socialist property. No warnings. No mercy. Punishment ranged from 10 years in prison, to execution. It didn't matter if you were a child. It didn't matter if you were desperate. It didn't matter if the fields had once been yours. Now they belonged to the state. And hunger had been redefined as treason. Villages heard about it first in whispers. Then in screams. In one province, a boy no older than 10 was caught with 3 ears of corn tucked inside his shirt. They stripped him in front of the village, bound his wrists, and dragged him to a cell where he would vanish. A mother in another oblast wandered into a field after sunset. Her children hadn't eaten in 4 days. She scooped a few stalks into her apron, thinking no one saw. She was wrong. The guards came at dawn. They found the husks still on the table, unmilled, uneaten. It didn't matter. She was sentenced that afternoon. Shot by evening. In schoolhouses, teachers began to notice fewer children. Some had died. Some had been taken. Others sat motionless at their desks, bones visible beneath their uniforms, eyes fixed on the floor. Too weak to lift a pencil. Too ashamed to ask why no one came back. And across the countryside, survival became innovation. Old shoes, boiled to soften the leather, to draw out whatever gelatin might remain in the sole. Tree bark scraped clean and mashed into paste. Soup made from grass. Glue melted from furniture, mixed with water. Livestock feed, not meant for humans, consumed raw, turning stomachs into battlegrounds. Saltpeter. Rotten hay. Clay. Even sawdust. Anything to give the illusion of fullness. Anything to make the ache go quiet for a while. And still, they died. Not quickly. Not all at once. But in pieces. A child's eyesight would go first. Then their balance. Then the swelling, the belly ballooning while the arms withered to twigs. Then the silence. Always the silence. And when someone did speak, it was in a whisper. One grandmother begged her son not to bury her until she stopped breathing. She had seen too many buried alive. In some villages, the dead outnumbered the living. And yet the law remained. 5 ears of grain. That was the line. Beyond it, your death. Or the death of someone you loved. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Fields were watched. Children were used as bait. Not because people were cruel. Because cruelty was the only thing left that still obeyed the rules. The state didn't need to patrol every farm. It didn't have to be everywhere. It only had to teach you to fear that it might be. So you looked over your shoulder. Even when no one was there. Especially when no one was there. And when you found something edible, something small, something half-rotten, you didn't smile. You didn't celebrate. You buried it. You rationed it. You prayed the smell wouldn't escape through the cracks in the wall. Because now, hunger was no longer something you suffered. It was something you could be guilty of. And in this new world, guilt carried a gun. You heard the laws. You saw the fields. You witnessed the silence they enforced. But history doesn't live in decrees. It lives in the ones who survived them. And what they remember, should never have to be remembered. In the village of Verbikn, in western Ukraine, Ol Hryn remembers waking one morning to find her mother hunched over the stove, not cooking, but weeping. There was no fire. The pot was filled with warm water and bark shavings. Nothing else. Ol, 7 years old, asked if it was soup. Her mother nodded. Later that evening, her younger brother drank from it and died in his sleep. His stomach too weak to process the wood, his organs too thin to protest. They buried him in a shallow grave behind the barn, under a broken fence post. Ol says she still dreams of his face, not when he was alive, but as they lowered him, wrapped in the family's last clean blanket. In Zavadivka, east of Poltava, Petro Varnin was 11 when his father collapsed on the road while searching for nettles. Petro dragged him home by the shoulders. His father died 3 days later, unable to speak, too dry to cry. Petro watched as his mother took off her earrings. A wedding gift from her own mother, and left to trade them for bread. She never returned. 2 weeks later, a neighbor quietly handed Petro the earrings. No food. No explanation. He still keeps them in a rusted tin box. In Nova Ushitsia, schoolteacher Yulia Datsenko opened her classroom one morning to find 5 children slumped over their desks. They were still breathing. Their stomachs were bloated. Their legs, motionless. One had soiled himself and hadn't moved to clean it. Their books were untouched. There had been no lessons that week. She tried to teach, tried to keep the rhythm of a world that no longer obeyed time. But the children no longer blinked when she called their names. One by one, they stopped attending. By winter's end, only 3 students remained. And even they sat with mouths open, not to speak, but to breathe. Yulia buried 10 children that year. In the village of Tokay, near Vinnytsia, Ivan Shram recalls the day his neighbor cooked her own son. He doesn't tell it like a horror story. He doesn't cry. He speaks as though he's describing the weather, a thing that simply happened. The woman, a widow, had 3 children. The youngest was sickly. One morning, a scream echoed through the village. When they entered her home, the pot was still warm. She didn't resist arrest. She didn't speak. She simply sat by the stove and rocked back and forth. Ivan says he never forgot the smell. Near Chernihiv, Helena Mikatenko recalls her grandfather being beaten with a shovel for hiding half a loaf of bread beneath the floorboards. The guards didn't ask questions. They didn't shout. They tied him to a post in front of the village. Left him there all day. By sunset, he was no longer breathing. The loaf was later found covered in dust, infested with mice. No one dared take it. In Trostianets, Anatoly Kalanyuk recalls waking up with blood in his mouth. He had been chewing his own tongue in his sleep, a habit he picked up after days of thirst. It was the only moisture he could find. He was 12. That same week, he watched as a young girl, no older than 8, tried to pull raw potatoes from a frozen field. Her hands were bare. The skin on her palms split open. She kept digging. The guards saw her. Anatoly looked away before the shot came. But he still heard it. Clear. Final. And then silence. None of these people were soldiers. None were rebels. None carried weapons. They carried spoons. Sacks. Fragments of food. Hope. And still, they were punished as enemies. Because in a system built on fear, hunger becomes rebellion. And survival becomes defiance. They do not tell these stories to be remembered. They tell them because someone must. Because they buried family in unmarked soil. Because the graves were dug too shallow. Because the world did not come. Because no one asked. Until now. You just heard what they endured. If your instinct is to turn away, that's human. But if you believe these voices deserve remembrance, show it. Subscribe. If not, drop a comment telling us why you won't. We dare you. Because silence has never been neutral. And neither is forgetting. They counted the dead in whispers. They counted the living in lies. By 1937, the famine was no longer in the streets. The bodies were buried. The fields had been resown. And the silences, the long, hollow silences, had settled deep into the bones of the survivors. But numbers cannot mourn. They do not cry or forget. They only tell. And when the census came, the numbers began to speak. The Soviet state had ordered the most ambitious population survey in its short, brutal history. It was meant to prove strength, a triumph of growth under socialism. A banner of statistics for the world to see. But when the figures came in, they betrayed the story. Millions were gone. Not misplaced. Not migrated. Gone. Entire regions undercounted. Villages missing. Names absent. Births that never followed. Generations erased from the ledger of existence. The census revealed what the soil had already whispered: the famine had consumed far more than the party had ever admitted. In Ukraine alone, entire districts showed population drop so steep they could not be explained by war, illness, or policy. And yet, these were not enemy reports. Not foreign propaganda. These were numbers gathered by Soviet hands. By loyal statisticians. By party-approved demographers. And that was the problem. Because truth, even when spoken quietly, even when printed in columns and ratios, was dangerous. Within weeks, the census was sealed. Buried. Declared invalid. The officials who oversaw it were accused of sabotage. Many were arrested. Some were executed. Others were disappeared, not just from office, but from memory. A new census was ordered. A corrected version. One that fit the narrative. One that didn't ask uncomfortable questions. One that didn't make the walls tremble. In this new version, the dead came back. Miraculously, the population had grown. The villages thrived. The system worked. And anyone who questioned the sudden resurrection was labeled a traitor. It wasn't just the numbers they buried. It was the wound itself. Because if no one died, then there was no famine. And if there was no famine, then there were no criminals. And if there were no criminals, then Stalin's hands remained clean. Clean hands. Soaked fields. The propaganda that followed rewrote not only the census but the story itself. Foreign enemies were blamed. Greedy peasants. Kulaks in disguise. Western agents trying to sabotage the Soviet miracle. And the people, those still limping through the aftermath, those who had buried brothers, sisters, mothers, and children, were told they had imagined it. That they were ungrateful. That they were weak. That their memory was treason. So they learned to keep it locked inside. To smile when asked. To clap at the right moments. To nod through the speeches. And in doing so, they helped build the myth. A myth of progress. Of glory. Of grain harvested in heroic quantities and distributed with generosity. Even as the truth festered beneath every step they took. Even as the shadows of the vanished lingered in empty homes and unmarked graves. History wasn't rewritten with ink. It was rewritten with silence. You thought it couldn't get worse. That the hunger was the end. That the silence of the census had closed the chapter. But the state was not finished. It had another tool. A blackboard. Wooden. Painted. Hung at the center of the village. It looked harmless. A simple list of names, places, numbers. But when the wrong name appeared, your village, your farm, your life, everything changed. This was no list. It was a sentence. The policy was simple. If a village failed to meet its grain quota, no matter the reason, it was blacklisted. No investigation. No appeal. Once your name was written on that board, you ceased to exist, not just as a citizen, but as a place. No more deliveries. No bread, no flour, no salt, no matches. The stores were emptied. The warehouses locked. Your own reserves had already been taken. Now, what remained, the scraps, the hope, was forbidden. And the worst part? You couldn't leave. Within hours of the listing, soldiers encircled the village. Trucks rolled in, not with aid, but with orders. Barbed wire. Patrols. Watchmen. Your roads were closed. Your paths sealed. Even the woods were watched. If you tried to flee, to beg a cousin in the next town for food, to barter with a passing traveler, to carry your child to safety, you were caught. Dragged back. Sometimes shot. Sometimes disappeared. The people inside these villages weren't enemies. They were laborers. Teachers. Mothers. Children. Some were too old to walk. Some were too young to speak. But now, they were prisoners in their own homes. Days passed. Then weeks. Then winter. And with every sunrise, the village grew quieter. The blackboard stayed. The soldiers stayed. The hunger stayed. What changed was the number of footsteps. The smell of rot behind closed doors. The way neighbors no longer knocked, not from fear, but because they knew what they'd find. Some burned furniture to stay warm. Some chewed bark to stay alive. Some wrote final letters they knew would never be sent. And still, Moscow didn't look away. Moscow looked through you. Because these weren't accidents. These were messages. Warnings, written not with ink, but with death. This is what happens when you fail. Not the system. You. And so, even those who still had food stayed silent. Even those not yet blacklisted lived like they were. Because the board could appear at any moment. A quota unmet. A whisper misheard. A favor unpaid. The village next to yours had vanished in 2 months. What made you think yours would be different? You kept your head down. Your voice low. Your grief buried deeper than the dead. You learned to pretend that nothing was wrong, until the day it was. You told yourself you could leave. That if it got worse, if the well dried up, if the last child died, if the rats stopped coming, you would run. Somewhere. Anywhere. Over the border, past the checkpoint, into the trees, across the next province. But in 1933, even that illusion was taken from you. It began with rumors, travelers stopped, trains turned back, wagons halted. Then came the orders. Official. Absolute. Final. No one leaves the Ukrainian SSR. Not for bread. Not for safety. Not for life. The borders were closed. Not just national ones, but internal. Guards appeared on village roads. Barricades at station platforms. Watchtowers at river crossings. People became suspects simply for walking. Inside, the famine clawed at lungs and spines. Outside, the promise of survival stood just a few miles away. But between them, rifles. So people ran anyway. Because when you're dying, risk no longer speaks in the language of fear. Entire families tried to slip through woods at night. Farmers disguised themselves as laborers. Mothers drugged their crying infants with herbs so they wouldn't be heard. Some were caught at stations. Hiding beneath train cars, clinging to axles, suffocating inside freight containers already packed with the desperate. Over 200,000 were captured. They weren't executed on the spot. That would have been merciful. They were processed. Interrogated. Stripped. Their belongings, whatever remained, confiscated. Their documents marked. Their bodies rerouted. Some were sent to filtration camps, holding zones not meant to hold, but to erase. Barbed wire. Mud floors. Wooden barracks built for half the number crammed inside. No heat. No medicine. No future. Disease spread faster than guilt. Typhus. Dysentery. Frostbite turned limbs black. And those who couldn't walk were left behind during transfers. Sometimes locked inside, the doors nailed shut. They died on trains no one recorded. They died on benches where no one stopped. They died with names no one said out loud anymore. Those who were returned to Ukraine were not welcomed back. They were listed. Watched. They returned to villages with less food, fewer neighbors, and more suspicion. Now, they were marked as troublemakers. And so they starved again, this time under closer eyes. The border had become a wall. Not built of stone. But of policy. Of surveillance. Of silence. And those who stayed behind were told to be grateful. Told they had it better than the ones in Siberia. Told that loyalty was measured by how quietly you suffered. But how do you measure loyalty when your ribs are visible through your shirt? When your mother disappears in the night for trying to find a potato? When the only road out leads to a camp? You don't. You only learn to wait for the knock on your door. To fold yourself smaller. To stop dreaming. To stop speaking. To stop moving at all. Because now, death wasn't something that came for you. It was something you lived beside, like a neighbor, like a shadow. And it would only notice you if you tried to run. What if you couldn't run from what was killing you? No comments. No shares. No voice. Only silence. If you're not silent now, prove it. Subscribe. If you won't, at least leave a comment so the silence doesn't win again. Not everyone bowed. Not everyone broke. Even as the grain was taken, the borders sealed, the children buried, there were still those who resisted. They had no armies. No weapons. Only words. Only memory. Only faith. And that made them dangerous. In small villages, priests refused to bless the state. They refused to take down the icons. They rang bells during funerals, even when the bodies were forbidden from being mourned. They lit candles in churches that had no bread but still held breath. They prayed in Ukrainian. So they were taken. Dragged from pulpits. Marched from altars. Beaten in front of their congregations, sometimes crucified against the very doors they once opened to the faithful. The churches were not simply closed. They were erased. Crosses were torn down. Bibles burned. The sacred vessels melted for scrap. Some churches were turned into warehouses. Others into stables. Many were just leveled. The domes collapsed inward, the frescoes buried beneath dirt and time. And when the people returned, if they returned, it was to silence. But it wasn't just the priests. Professors in Kiev who taught Ukrainian literature suddenly found their courses cancelled. Historians who tried to preserve folk traditions were accused of nationalism. Librarians who refused to replace banned books with Soviet texts vanished without explanation. Teachers were forced to instruct in Russian. Textbooks rewritten. Entire pages torn out. Even the alphabet began to shift. It was linguistic suffocation, gradual, deliberate. The mouth made to forget its shape. The ear retrained to flinch at familiar vowels. And in the countryside, farmers who spoke in proverbs and sang the old harvest songs were told those songs were illegal. They were not revolutionary. They were counterproductive. Their dialects were backward. Their traditions, feudal. And yet they kept speaking. Quietly. A grandmother teaching her granddaughter the lullaby her own mother sang. A man carving old Cossack symbols into the beams of his barn. A boy writing forbidden poetry in the margins of his ration book. They knew it could cost them everything. And for many, it did. Some were taken in the night. Others denounced by neighbors. Others simply found dead in the street, the charge of subversive activity carved into their legacy like a final scar. But the repression was never just about what they did. It was about who they were. Ukrainian. Not in theory. Not in flag. But in blood, in breath, in soil, in spirit. And that, above hunger, above rebellion, above failure, was what Stalin feared most. Identity. Because identity cannot be taxed. It cannot be redistributed. It cannot be collectivized. And so, the war became spiritual. Cultural. Intimate. It wasn't enough to starve the body. The memory had to die too. The poems. The prayers. The ways of planting, of blessing, of burying the dead. The state wanted to grind it all down into ash and numbers. But memory clings. Even to hunger. No one kept count in real time. There were no announcements. No ledgers. No sirens. The bodies didn't come all at once. They came slowly, in silence, in shame. At first, you could bury them. You still had the strength to dig. You still believed someone might ask where they went. But eventually, the ground froze. The shovels broke. And the questions stopped coming. By the time it was over, more than 3.9 million people in Ukraine were gone. Gone not in war. Not in plague. Gone by hunger, manufactured, managed, calculated. And that number is just the estimate. Some say it was more. Others insist it must have been. Because how do you count ghosts? In Vinnytsia, the death rate climbed past 50%. In Sumy, entire neighborhoods were emptied in weeks. In the Poltava region, villages simply vanished, no census, no graveyards, only abandoned cottages rotting beneath the wind. 10% dead in one place. 30 in another. 40 down the road. No battlefield. No bullets. Just time and hunger. The survivors stopped burying them. There were too many. The bodies were left where they fell, on thresholds, in fields, beside ovens that never burned again. Children died in their beds and were not moved. Parents died at the table, their bowls still empty. Neighbors walked past corpses and said nothing, not out of cruelty, but because grief had become ordinary. In some towns, carts rolled through at night, collecting the dead like refuse. Sometimes, they were piled onto sleds. Sometimes, into pits. But many never left their homes. Years later, when the doors were opened again, they were still there. Mothers with infants cradled to their ribs. Old men frozen in prayer. The smell, the presence, lingered long after the door shut again. Others drifted down rivers, bloated, faceless, stripped of names. Children who had tried to crawl for help. Fathers who had collapsed on the road. In the forests, the wolves grew fat. There were no funerals. No wreaths. No black cloth across the doors. You didn't light candles. You didn't ring bells. You stopped mourning, because mourning never ended. The numbers we have are only shadows. Some regions refused to submit full data. Others altered it under pressure. Many simply had no one left to report. They are called statistical ghosts, the vanished whose names were never written down, whose deaths were never acknowledged, whose lives slipped between the cracks of official narrative. You can't exhume them. You can't interview them. You can only feel their absence. In photographs without faces. In census columns left blank. In school records where classrooms halved overnight. The state called it a tragedy. A natural event. Unavoidable. But the numbers say otherwise. Because they don't just measure loss. They measure intention. How many grain trains left the village that month? How many children were arrested for stealing a potato? How many soldiers stood outside the last food store? How many quotas were enforced long after there was nothing left to take? No war. No drought. No plague. Only silence. Enforced. Engineered. Executed. And behind that silence, millions. Ghosts of a nation. Ghosts of memory. Ghosts that now ask only this, to be known. Call it what it was. Holodomor. Not a word spoken lightly. Not a name given by historians in far-off cities. A word forged by survivors. Two roots. Holod, hunger. Mority, to exterminate. Hunger, weaponized. Hunger, with an executioner's hand. Hunger, not as tragedy, but as verdict. Not everyone agrees. Some still call it a famine. A miscalculation. A failure of planning. A storm of circumstance. But look closer. No natural famine seals borders. No accidental food shortage deploys soldiers. No crop failure jails children for taking bread crusts from their own fields. Famine does not blacklist entire towns. Famine does not need execution orders. Famine does not come with quotas. This was not nature. This was choice. And choices, when calculated, become crimes. That's why scholars around the world have called it what it truly was, genocide. Not just an economic catastrophe. A campaign, political, targeted, ruthless, to destroy not just a population, but a people. To erase memory. To mutilate identity. To drain a culture of its voice, and fill the silence with obedience. And the evidence lives in the numbers. In the orders. In the blackboards, the trains, the barbed wire. But it also lives in the stories. The songs that were silenced. The churches that were leveled. The teachers who vanished for refusing to rewrite a nation's history in another language. In 2006, Ukraine officially recognized the Holodomor as genocide. And since then, more than 30 countries have followed. They looked at the evidence, the witnesses, the archives, the graveyards with no names, and made a choice, to remember truth. To honor the dead not as accidents, but as victims. To call a crime what it is. But there is still resistance. There is still denial. And that denial is not passive. To this day, the Russian Federation refuses to acknowledge the Holodomor as genocide. They call it a shared Soviet tragedy. They blur the lines, dilute the intent, paint it as famine with no author, a shadow with no hand. They deny the documents. They discredit the testimonies. They accuse those who remember of politicizing history. Because to admit the truth would mean confronting a legacy built on corpses. And so the war over memory continues. Not with tanks or planes, but with narratives, maps, textbooks, laws. A different kind of frontline, one where silence becomes permission, and forgetting becomes complicity. And in that war, you have a choice too. Because history isn't just what happened. It's what we're willing to keep happening. If the truth matters to you, you'll keep this memory alive. Subscribe to Flashback Historian and keep this flame burning. If not, comment your reason. Be honest. History will still judge us. While millions starved in silence, the world turned its gaze elsewhere. Not because it didn't know, but because it didn't want to know. In 1933, at the very height of the famine, while Ukrainian children were digging through animal droppings for undigested grain, while mothers boiled weeds into poison, while fathers hung themselves beside empty pantries, the United States extended diplomatic recognition to the Soviet Union. It was a handshake over a mass grave. Negotiated in back rooms. Signed with smiles. Photographed for history. There was no mention of famine in the papers. No reference to mass death in the speeches. No whispers about the barbed wire, the grain seizures, the bodies rotting in doorways. Instead, there was talk of new beginnings. Of trade opportunities. Of mutual respect. The world's most powerful democracy had just legitimized a regime starving its own people. And soon after, the Soviet Union was granted entry into the League of Nations, the very institution meant to uphold international peace, to prevent atrocity, to serve as a voice for the voiceless. But Ukraine had no voice. No seat. No flag. Only silence. And it wasn't just governments who looked away. Much of the Western media, the supposed watchdogs, the truth-tellers, reported nothing. Or worse, they lied. Walter Duranty, the Moscow correspondent for the New York Times, assured the world there was no famine. He called the reports exaggerated. He said the harvest had been poor, but there is no actual starvation. He won a Pulitzer Prize for those words. Even as survivors clawed at the walls of empty warehouses, even as villages went dark forever. Other journalists, some brave, some desperate to tell the truth, tried to raise alarm. But their voices were buried under bureaucracy, drowned in the noise of diplomacy, or dismissed as anti-Soviet hysteria. And while the world debated politics, Ukraine buried its dead without names. Why did the silence hold? Because the Soviet Union was too important to offend. Too large to ignore. Too useful to provoke. A future partner. A future market. A future ally against fascism. And so, the West let the famine burn, off-stage, off-screen, outside the frame. It became the price of pragmatism. The cost of geopolitical calculation. And the dead? They were counted quietly, if at all. Their suffering was too inconvenient for the headlines. Too complex for the editorials. Too damning for the diplomats. And so, the lie was easier. It was easier to pretend it didn't happen. Easier to praise Soviet industrial progress. Easier to welcome the red flag into polite company. The genocide had no witnesses. Not because they weren't there. But because the world closed its eyes. The bodies were gone. The fields were replanted. The trains moved again. But the silence wasn't just a byproduct of survival. It was policy. It was law. It was engineered. You weren't allowed to remember the famine. You weren't even allowed to say the word. Inside the Soviet Union, the Holodomor didn't happen. It wasn't taught. It wasn't published. It wasn't real. And if you said otherwise, you disappeared. The Soviet state didn't just erase the dead. It erased their context. It erased their witnesses. Libraries were purged. Records vanished. Census archives locked or rewritten. The famine was buried under layers of official language, food difficulties, temporary shortages, economic restructuring. What the people experienced in their bones was renamed out of existence. But memory doesn't obey decrees. So the government turned its force inward, not on grain, not on peasants, but on truth. Tens of thousands were arrested for spreading anti-Soviet agitation, which could mean mentioning the famine, whispering about the missing, refusing to parrot the new narrative. In schoolhouses, students were taught that kulaks had sabotaged the harvests, that imperialist agents had conspired to withhold grain, that everything was under control, that Stalin had led them through a temporary storm with unshakable wisdom. But some students had watched their families starve. They were told they had imagined it. Told they were wrong. Told to confess their misperceptions. And when they didn't, they vanished, too. Teachers who tried to speak truth were re-educated. Which often meant being relocated. Which often meant being sentenced. Which often meant never coming back. Even party officials, once loyal, once complicit, were now purged. Because if the famine had happened, someone must be blamed. But it could not be Stalin. It could not be the system. So scapegoats were invented. Local officials were accused of hoarding grain. District planners were labeled saboteurs. Entire chains of command were shattered and rebuilt, not to fix the lie, but to bury it deeper. And in this version of events, the people were never starved. They were saved. By the state. By Stalin. By the system that had killed them. Photographs were retouched. Newspapers carefully edited. Maps redrawn. In Ukraine, memorials to the dead were forbidden. Mass graves remained unmarked. Testimonies were collected, and destroyed. And anyone who dared tell their story risked being charged with slander, or worse. It became possible to live through a genocide and never see it named. Children grew up hearing whispers behind doors. They knew not to ask questions. They knew not to repeat what they heard. They learned silence the way they learned grammar, from repetition, from fear, from survival. And for decades, that silence held. Even after Stalin died. Even after the archives began to thaw. Even after the borders softened. The trauma had been planted so deeply, it grew roots. And even now, many carry the memory as something shameful. Something best left unspoken. Because when the state erases the past, it doesn't just control what you remember. It controls who you believe yourself to be. It wasn't over. The fields had been replanted. The graves covered. The archives sealed. But history, like a wound, doesn't close when ignored. It bleeds beneath the surface. Then came the next war. When Nazi tanks rolled into Ukraine in 1941, they didn't arrive in a land of strength. They arrived in a land already hollowed out, starved, censored, traumatized. A land that had barely begun to mourn the last disaster before it was plunged into another. The Second World War carved fresh scars into Ukraine's soil. More than 8 million Ukrainian lives were lost. Men conscripted into Soviet ranks and sent to die in endless waves. Villages razed. Cities leveled. Entire Jewish communities, gone. Massacres like Babin Yar, unspoken for decades, like the Holodomor before it. Ukraine became a battlefield again. Not just for territory, but for memory. For control. For silence. And when the war ended, the hunger returned, like a ghost wearing a different mask. In 1946 and 1947, famine swept Ukraine once more. Another 400,000 died. The war had left the land broken, but the policies had not changed. Grain quotas remained absurd. Export priorities outweighed domestic survival. The West sent aid, but much of it was redirected by the Soviet state before it reached the starving. And once again, the government denied it. Once again, the word famine was forbidden. Once again, people were told to be grateful while their children starved in silence. Was it punishment? Revenge for perceived disloyalty during the war? Or simply the same old machinery, still grinding, still blind? By now, Ukrainians knew better than to ask. They suffered, buried, and endured, because that is what they had been taught to do. But beneath it all, a question began to rise. Unspoken at first. Then whispered in kitchens. Then murmured in the surviving churches. A question that had haunted them since the blackboards, the quotas, the sealed borders: is history repeating itself? It wasn't paranoia. It was pattern. Famine. War. Erasure. Again. And again. And again. The world called them survivors. But survival without recognition is not life, it is a slow death of the soul. And by the time the 1947 famine ended, 3 generations had been marked by hunger. The grandparents had been starved under collectivization. The parents under the Nazis and Soviets. The children, born into silence. This was more than trauma. It was inheritance. And even now, even decades later, even as Ukraine declared its independence in the 1990s, the question still echoes: will we ever be allowed to remember without fear? Will the past always wait behind the curtain of the present, ready to return with new teeth? History doesn't always knock. Sometimes it just walks back in, wearing yesterday's clothes, and smiles. She is 94. Her hands tremble. Her voice is thin. But when she speaks about the winter of 1933, the words sharpen. There was no sky, she says. Only smoke. And hunger. She remembers watching her brother die on the kitchen floor. She remembers eating pine needles. She remembers the knock at the door, and how her mother told her to hide under the bed and not make a sound, not even if she heard screaming. And then, she remembers surviving. She lived through Stalin. She lived through Hitler. She lived through the camps, the Cold War, and the Second Famine. She lives now. And she is not alone. Across Ukraine, into the 2020s, there are still survivors of the Holodomor. Fewer every year. But they remain, living time capsules of a nation nearly erased. Some never spoke of it, not even to their children. They feared the walls might still be listening. But others, when they reached their final decades, began to speak. And once they began, they did not stop. They spoke at schools. They testified in courtrooms. They lit candles at newly built memorials. And when asked why they remembered, their answer was always the same: because no one else would. These are not just victims. They are witnesses. They are the last living memory of a crime the world tried to forget. One man recites a folk song he wasn't allowed to sing as a boy. One woman still keeps her grandmother's embroidered cloth hidden in a wooden chest. It was nearly burned in 1932 for being nationalist. Another tells his grandson the family name they were forced to change, and makes him promise to write it down. They have passed through a century of lies, and they still choose to speak. And their voices are not only personal, they are political. Because the Holodomor was not just about starvation. It was about breaking a people. And these voices, these faces, these stories, they are proof it failed. Ukraine still stands. Its language. Its music. Its fields. Its faith. And still, its fight. Because the struggle did not end with Stalin's death. It did not end with Soviet collapse. It continues. Every attempt to erase the Ukrainian identity, every invasion, every rewritten textbook, every bomb that falls on a language school, is part of the same war. A war not only for land, but for memory. Not only for borders, but for truth. And the last survivors of the Holodomor know it. Because they've seen it before. When asked what keeps her going, one survivor says, "They tried to kill us with silence. So I speak." That's not history. That's resistance. And you're hearing it now, in a voice the Soviets tried to bury. It still breathes. It still burns. It still belongs to the soil they never surrendered. This wasn't just a famine. It was erasure. A carefully engineered disappearance. Of food. Of memory. Of resistance. They didn't just starve the body. They starved the future. And what remains is not just grief, it's absence. Empty chairs where voices should be. Blank spaces in family trees. Unmarked graves beneath roads now paved over and forgotten. But forgetting is not neutral. Forgetting is the final weapon. The quietest. The most effective. Because when the past is erased, the lie becomes truth. And the next time the machinery grinds to life, the next sealed border, the next blacklisted village, the next ration line that leads to a cemetery, there will be no warning left. Only repetition. To remember, then, is not an act of nostalgia. It's an act of defiance. Because the story doesn't end with death. It ends with silence. Unless you refuse to let it. To remember is to return names to the faceless. To light candles where the state left darkness. To say, we saw this. We heard it. We will not look away again. But remembrance isn't passive. It requires more than sympathy. It demands responsibility. Responsibility to ask. To speak. To challenge. To carry the weight of history without turning away. Because stories rot when left untold. And silence, the very weapon used against them, begins again when we grow comfortable. This story was not buried in the past. It is still breathing in the present. It is encoded in the bones of the living, in a country that still fights to own its name, its language, its right to speak pain without permission. So what does it mean to remember? It means not forgetting when forgetting becomes convenient. It means telling the story again, and telling it differently. With names. With context. With truth. It means giving voice to the dead, and giving warning to the living. Because if this happened once, it can happen again. It already has. And unless we remember, it will. You've heard the silence. You've walked through the fire they were never allowed to describe. You know now what forgetting costs. If you believe this matters, subscribe to Flashback Historian. Let their story live in you. And if not, if you choose to move on, scroll past, turn away, say why. Say it in the comments. But understand, history has always recorded the names of those who stayed quiet. This is Flashback Historian, we tell the stories they buried. The ones scraped from beneath layers of propaganda. The ones whispered across generations in cracked voices and broken languages. The ones censored, erased, denied, not because they were untrue, but because they were too true. We bring them back. Not to relive the pain. But to make sure it wasn't for nothing. The Holodomor was more than an atrocity. It was a lesson carved in famine. A warning written in silence. A memory nearly lost, until voices like yours helped carry it forward. Because history doesn't vanish when the fires go out. It lingers. In the shadows of new conflicts. In the speeches of new tyrants. In the systems that still believe forgetting is more efficient than healing. If we forget, it will happen again. Not in the same way, but with the same hunger for control. The same willingness to destroy lives in the name of power. The same cold machinery, perfected only by its denial. You've spent the last hour walking through a graveyard no one marked. You've met the dead they tried to unmake. You've heard the echoes they swore would never return. And now, you carry it. The weight of their story. The fire of their resistance. So here's the final challenge. Subscribe. Not for us. Not for content. Not for algorithms or updates or titles. Subscribe for them. For the mother who whispered lullabies over empty cradles. For the teacher who refused to lie. For the farmer who carved truth into a barn beam before the soldiers came. For the last survivor who still lights a candle and waits for someone to ask why. And if you choose not to, that's your right. But please. Explain yourself below. We'll wait. The ghosts will too. And they always have time for silence.